Welcome back. I hope this week's going well for you so far. Our focus this week is the so called golden era, and we're all astute enough to realize that one group's golden era does not necessarily mean that it's a golden era for everybody. Many observers have commented on the fact that the period following the war, 1945 to 1965, was the greatest North American religious revival ever. Men and women who had shown precious little interest in the church before the war flocked to it in numbers that confounded the forecasters. There was a boom in attendance, membership, financial support, periodical subscriptions, and book sales across the board for all church traditions. It began with the doubling and then the quadrupling of Sunday school enrollments. Then the parents followed the children, leading to a boom in adult education. And this, in turn, resulted in a building spree, often in the new suburbs where there had previously been no churches. So between 1945 and 1966, the United Church of Canada built 1,500 churches and church halls and 600 manses. Now, to more fully understand this growth, we need to note the fact that the upsurge was largely socially conservative and nostalgic at its roots. Evangelists like Billy Graham and Charles Templeton were popular. Many people sought to restore the oft-times idealized, favorable aspects of a pre-war life, and church and Sunday school were part of that mix. It was also an era when the Cold War and the reality of nuclear proliferation fed anxiety. And so there was a deep desire for normalcy, not for novelty, for reassurance, not challenge. Now, in the United Church of Canada, that translated into ongoing opposition to drinking, gambling, pornography, and horse racing on Sunday. With every denomination doing well financially and numerically, there was little incentive for innovative styles of interchurch relationships. There were desultory talks between the United Church and the Anglicans, and that produced few results outside of the hymnary, the Red Hymn Book. And visitors to Canada remarked on the degree to which churches were thriving on the capital of the past. On Sunday mornings, the churches and Sunday schools were crowded, but Sunday evening belonged to Ed Sullivan. The new life in Sunday school brought little interest for weekday communion or for the Wednesday evening prayer meeting. This is by no means to imply that those who were part of the post-war boom were only interested in getting. For instance, there was an explosion in men's work in service and study and inspirational activities, and the structures of the church sought to keep before members the social realities such as mental health, problems confronting the aged and pensioners, issues of family life, the dangers of materialism, and so on. A commission on Christian marriage and the Christian home was appointed in 1944. Another response was an upsurge in couples clubs and special family services at the same time as publicly deploring the employment of mothers outside the home as being a threat to the stability of the family. So there are a variety of things going on. The church was not immune to the radical challenging and change that characterized society in the 1960s. Institutionally, there was a great deal of energy and money being spent paying off the new church plants of the 1950s, so the resources for innovation and new mission were slim. And the Sunday school graduates of the 1950s showed very little interest in the youth groups of the 1960s. Interest in religion was contrasted with, quote, an endless relativity in faith and morals, end of quote. And the clergy, on the other hand, struggles against role models in which society cast them, but for which it had little use. After the post-war boom, worship attendance and finances were merely leveling off. However, a common memory of relentless growth saw such plateauing as a failure. Social rituals such as the Stanley Cup, the Grey Cup, and the Calgary Stampede clearly meant more to many Canadians than the rituals of religion. In 1960, the General Council was forced to face reality, and while maintaining that abstinence was the wisest and safest course, admitted that responsible church members took a drink now and then. This represents the first official acknowledgement of what many accepted was the case. The new reality sparked a variety of responses. There were new service books and new hymn books. Most denominations developed new church curricula. The core curriculum came into use faster and more widely than the publishers dared to hope. 600,000 of the adult resource books were sold the first summer, and total sales far outstripped United Church of Canada Sunday School registrations, which demonstrates that this curriculum was being used far outside the boundaries of the denomination. Institutionally, the church was beginning to rationalize struggling rural congregations into pastoral charges, and that resulted in much bitterness. In 1962, the Women's Missionary Society and the Women's Association were joined together to form the United Church Women. In many ways, this was what observers refer to as an aberrant time. In other words, it was a time in Canadian history when a series of factors came together in an unusual conjunction. If we consider the period from 1928 to 1945, there were at least two major events which required a tremendous degree of subjugating the individual to the greater needs of society. Both the Depression and especially the Second World War were efforts on a national scale. Individuals became schooled in the pattern of setting aside individual differences for the sake of a larger cause. They learned to find their identity in organizations and institutions. Thus, membership, being an identified member of an identifiable group, became a key social factor. At the same time, once the war was over, there were significant resources available through different industries and institutions. That meant freedom to innovate, to explore, and try new ideas in industry, commerce, government, and the church. Governments were flush with cash and were able to expand at a great rate. There was money flowing into the church, and the post-war baby boom created a demand for both churches and social services. A large number of non-church social organizations familiar today had not yet come into being, and so the churches were the focuses of many different recreational and social activities. Governments collaborated in this social organization through legislation that heavily restricted other activities on Sunday. After the upheaval and disruption of the previous decade and a half, many, if not most, post-war Canadians were desperate for conformity and social calm. Furthermore, the generally positive economic circumstances and the flood of consumer goods that followed the retooling of wartime factories meant that there was widespread prosperity and satisfaction. The reality of the Cold War and the fear of communism's spread also reinforced conformity and wanting to be part of the group. This post-war social consensus began to fray as Canada moved into the 1960s. The absence of a grand national cause allowed for a flourishing of individual expression and the surfacing of both disdain for the rigid role definitions of the previous generation. Both through immigration and through travel, Canadians were experiencing a wider world, which brought with it, amongst other things, an awareness of the breadth of religious and spiritual options. Many churches and church leaders, raised in a more conformist time, were ill-equipped to deal with a society that was apparently questioning everything. A major event for the United Church in this era was the publication of the so-called New Curriculum. And this was a triumph of cutting-edge educational methods joined with up-to-date positions in biblical studies. To many people, both inside and outside the church, it was a breath of fresh air. For many more, especially in the church, it was the dynamiting of many foundational principles of Christianity. Although there was nothing in the new curriculum that would surprise someone with a theological education, the introduction of the results of historical, critical, biblical thinking rocked many lay people who were used to a generally mildly literate understanding of Scripture. By that I mean, if pushed, most United Church members would agree that Genesis 1 and 2 did not offer accurate scientific accounts of the origins of life, but they weren't very often pushed. The general historicity and unity of the First Testament texts was pretty widely accepted. That literal acceptance expanded and hardened when shifted to the Gospels. Many who attended classes in the newly emerging university departments of religion were exposed to elaborate explanations of how miraculous events in Scripture were really natural phenomena. In other words, they were, quote, real events showing God at work in the world, rather than miraculous, defined as unnatural or inexplicable. In essence, the effort was made to bridge any gaps between science and religion by arguing that the former was simply another way of seeing God at work. For many people, the new curriculum was their first exposure to long accepted items from the theological catalog. For instance, the differences in the gospel and the reality that the writers were not immediate disciples of Jesus. The questioning of the tradition of a one-time mass exodus from Egypt, the acknowledgement of certain mythologizing elements in the book of Acts, the recognition that the Gospels are not biography, and so on. And while there were those who found this liberating, there were also many who experienced it as profoundly challenging and unwelcoming. It undermined their certainty, and in a society that naturally equated true with factual, it sounded a lot like the church was saying the Bible was not true. At the same time, in many of its official pronouncements, the various levels of United Church governance were beginning to move away from some of the more familiar language of the faith. Church leaders increasingly saw themselves as seeking to engage with individuals and institutions for whom traditional terminology lacked any particular relevance. So, while on the one hand, United Church worship goers were hearing and singing the familiar language of sin, redemption, salvation, and so on, their church was increasingly using the language of social sciences. Where much worship and spirituality was still very much individually centered, the wider church was using far more systemic language. Where the congregation and society were very much pictured marching arm in arm, the General Council was more vocal in criticizing what it saw as government failures involving a marginalized group. Where capitalism was often accepted as the finest social expression of Christian values, church voices were increasingly calling out its failures and taking a stance over against accepted institutions. Many more traditional members could not figure out what Christianity, which they understood as being personal and private, had to do with social issues like the Vietnam War, nuclear armaments, pollution, systemic poverty, and so on. And these differences were also caught up in theological education as students divided themselves off as Bartians and Bultmannians, and they were introduced to emerging practices in social sciences and counseling, which called into question some of the inherited practices. Thus, while the United Church of Canada ended the 1960s still appearing quite strong in various quantitative measures, the fissures were beginning to appear. The last year of membership growth was 1965. In the last year that the numbers of members of the United Church actually grew was 1965. Different patterns of worship were emerging. captured in new service books and a new hymn book published early in the next decade. What was to become a long-term pattern of shining a light of faith and social research onto institutions like the family and celebrating a breadth of expression had begun. Engagement with various churches in different parts of the world was beginning to impact the long-standing view as North America as the source of the gospel for, quote, a world in darkness. And this, in turn, would change those relationships profoundly, excuse me, and draw the church into various liberation struggles. One of the greatest lasting impact on this period is felt in today's congregations, where many in leadership look to the 1950s and the 1960s as the golden age or the norm by which everything else should be measured. However, as we've seen, the church of that period was the product of social and institutional factors that had not been in existence before and cannot be recreated. Thinking of an aberrant era as the model and the norm continues to afflict many congregations today.